Live from Eyewitness News, a Campaign 2024 special presentation, the 2nd Congressional District Debate.
And tonight we take you to the 2nd District for a debate between longtime incumbent Congressman Joe Courtney and his Republican challenger Mike France. Thanks for joining us tonight at 7. I'm Stephanie Simone. We're going to take a live look at Connecticut College in New London right now. WFSB is partnering with the Day of New London newspaper and the League of Women Voters on this debate. Let's take a look at the race here. This is a rematch when France took on Courtney 2 years ago. He lost by 50,000 votes. Courtney has held this large district since 2006. It runs from Madison to Enfield and encompasses the entire eastern portion of the state and is home to the largest submarine maker in the world, Electric Boat. Courtney is a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee. France is a Navy veteran and works for a small local defense contractor. Let's send it over to Evans Hall at Connecticut College, where debate moderator Lee Howard from the Day is about to get started.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Day in New London and of our partners, WFSB TV and Connecticut College, it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for a debate between candidates for the office of U.S. Representative in the 2nd District of Connecticut. Much appreciation for this evening goes to Connecticut College for helping set up our space, to the League of Women Voters for debate and questions advice, and to students here for serving as timers and providing their own questions. Thank you also to the candidates for stepping up to run for office. We recognize that running is difficult and we appreciate your willingness. The audience is asked to hold applause or verbalizations until the end of the debate. The order of the questions has been determined ahead of time, but neither candidate knows what those questions will be. Timers will hold signs up indicating to the candidate that you have 30 seconds, then 15 seconds left to speak, so that you know how much time you have left to respond. Then a stop sign will go up, and there I may intervene to get to the next question. Our questioners here tonight are Owen Poole of the Day's editorial board to my left, Susan Raff, WFSB's chief political reporter just beyond Mr. Poole, and Sophia Williams, an ambassador of Camel's Vote, a nonpartisan campus initiative that promotes voting and civic engagement. My name is Lee Howard, and I am the Day's business editor, and our candidates tonight are Incumbent Democratic Representative Joe Courtney and Republican challenger Mike France. So let's get started. We flipped a coin backstage, and Mr. Courtney won and chose to give the final statement. Our first question will be for 2 minutes, and each candidate will speak without rebuttal. Subsequent questions will allow the first responder to speak for 90 seconds, followed by a 2-minute response and then a 30-second rebuttal by the original speaker. For our first 2-minute response, I asked Mr. France to begin by answering this question. Tell us something about your government experience and what has compelled you to run for Congress. 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Lee. Thank you to Owen, Sarah. The important thing about my service for me was the fact of service. When I looked at retiring from the Navy and giving back to my community, it looked like the best way to do that was to get involved with my family and my children who were all swimmers, starting the swim team. But that ultimately led to the opportunity to serve my town council. And what I learned there, and the key stays with me today, is that's how government is supposed to work. The people are supposed to be able to come seek redress with their government. In the case of the town council, people came to and they were able to speak for 3 minutes and expect an answer. Ultimately, I was encouraged to run for state legislative office and serve in the state legislature for 8 years. And over that 11 years in service, the biggest benefit that I saw for myself was the experience of serving as a finance committee chair on my town council and serving the appropriations committee, because it gave a front row seat to how policy is supposed to be set by government. Somebody comes up with a good idea, brings it to you, and you like it, but sometimes there's a cost to that, and we need to make sure that when these good ideas are brought forward, that they're funded and properly supported. When I looked at the direction our country was headed and the service that I had, I realized that I couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore after serving over 20 years in uniform, and I decided that I needed to run for Congress and serve the people of Eastern Connecticut and turn our country around. I thank for the opportunity, and look forward to the questions today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney, you have 2 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Lee, and to the sponsors this evening, and to Conn College for hosting this event. It's good to see my friend and rival, Mike France, here this evening. In my time in Congress, where I've had the honor to represent this region, where my wife Audrey and I raised our children, I have been working hard on behalf of getting growth and success in this region, and it is growing. In 2023, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the Norwich, New London job market is the fastest growing in Connecticut, the second fastest in New England. My work in Washington has been connected to that growth. As ranking member of the Sea Power Subcommittee, which authorizes shipbuilding, Navy shipbuilding, Electric Boat Shipyard, the 120-year company that's right across the river here, again, has been working as a premier submarine builder. Last year hired 5,300 new workers, the highest in the history of the company, 3,000 so far this year. Tonight, as we stand here, there are 779 job openings. During this hiring spree, a lot of the training programs and school programs that workers are skilling up to take these positions have come through my other committee on the education and workforce. There's more to be done to take advantage of this growth. We need to address the need for affordable housing in this region, affordable daycare, and also the rising costs of health care, which again, I would like to see the progress that we've made in cutting prescription drug costs applied towards working age citizens in the 2nd Congressional District. Again, it's also about diversifying the economy. My office has been directly involved from Enfield to Stonington to Madison to Thompson, and I want to continue that work because this is a great part of Connecticut, and its best days lie ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Our first panelist question goes to Mr. Poole for Mr. Courtney.
Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is opposing a second Virginia-class submarine in the fiscal year 2025 defense budget because the funding would take money away from the Navy's next-generation fighter program. Republicans in Congress have also been backing away from the 2 subs a year commitment we've seen in recent years. As a person running for Congress in a district heavily dependent on submarine contracts, how would you weigh the impact to the local economy of one less submarine in 2025 against other defense priorities?
So first of all, we need attack submarines. There's no question about it, strategically and for a lot of external factors that are happening in the world today. If you look at the workload that right now exists at Electric Boat, there are 19 submarines in the production queue that have been funded and authorized. We just commissioned one a few weeks ago, USS New Jersey. The Iowa is going to get delivered to the Navy later this year, 2 next year, and the 2 the year after that. But the fact of the matter is we're retiring old Los Angeles-class subs, and we need to replace them quickly. The Secretary's comment was in the context of a budget cap, which again was passed by Congress last May. I think when we go back in December, we're going to lift that cap, and I think there's going to be headroom and space to add that boat back, just like the House Armed Services Committee did and the Senate Armed Services Committee did last summer. We have not finished the job yet in terms of the budget, but when we go back in town for the lame duck session, I think we're going to follow up to, again, strengthen the Virginia program.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, you have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. And 2 submarines per year is important, not only to the economy of the region, but to our national defense. We need to have those assets out there in order to be able to project the force that is needed to protect our interests around the world. But what's more important than bringing contracts is actually delivering on those contracts. And for the last 6 years, we've only delivered 1 submarine per year on average. And the challenge with that is that, unfortunately, the projections that Joe Courtney just put forward of the projection of delivering 2 next year and 2 the year after that, the Secretary of the Navy doesn't agree. He doesn't believe we're going to be back on pace for 2 per year until 2028. That is the real impact of what's going on, and it's a frustration that when I listen to my opponent talk on the radio, he blames COVID for the reason that we didn't deliver 2 submarines per year. When the reality is that started in 2019. Long before COVID was on. So the problems existed before, and while I acknowledge COVID probably was the reason we didn't deliver a submarine at all in 2021, it was not the reason. It shows the lack of understanding and lack of knowledge of what the problem is. It deals with a lack of maintenance infrastructure. It deals with a lack of supply chain. It deals with a number of issues in a complex system starting and ending with the oversight of Congress. That is the failure, and that is what we need with my almost 30 years of submarine acquisition experience to actually deliver 2 submarines per year, not just keep providing a contract for 2.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney, you have 30
So
seconds.
the shipyard right today has now 23,000 workers. When I first went to Congress, it was hovering around 7,000. We're going through a generational shift where we're bringing on board new people, and there is going to be some delays that are caused by that, and the great retirement from COVID aggravated those delays. But the fact of the matter is the pace is picking up, and having a consistent procurement signal is the best way to strengthen the supply chain so that small companies are going to invest in the program and that we are going to send a message to people that their job is going to be secure for years to come. That's the strategy for bringing back the production cadence we need in the Virginia program.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Next question goes to Ms. Raff for Mr. France to start.
Mr. France, women's rights are a critical issue, not just in Connecticut, but all across this country. There are some candidates, even this election cycle, who feel that it doesn't matter in Connecticut because we have such strong abortion rights. You posted something on your Facebook page recently that some women found offensive. I'd like you to comment on that and how important reproductive rights are, not just in this election, but going forward.
Thank you for the question. And the goal related to breast cancer awareness, that breast cancer is a very important issue to my family. My mother-in-law was diagnosed early in her life with breast cancer, and thankful to early diagnosis and treatment, lived a long life. And so the goal with the post that we made, and my team looked and found a post that was posted in or published in Clio magazine, an Australian women's magazine. It was rated one of the best campaigns for breast cancer awareness. And here we are, 3 weeks later, still talking about breast cancer awareness. So I think that campaign worked. There are people that did not appreciate that, but I think the important part is raising awareness to a very important disease and providing information. And contrary to what most politicians do is they put up a graphic and say, see, today is Breast Cancer Awareness Day. What we did is we tried to share useful information that would provide an oncologist to provide how to do self-examination so that women could learn more about how to fight this disease.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney.
Yeah, so I'm not going to debate the aesthetics of that Facebook post. I kind of think it speaks for itself. The problem that I have in terms of Mike's record when he was in state legislature was that he was one of 3 people who voted against a bill to extend insurance coverage for 3D mammograms. The vote was 139 to 3. Again, this was in 2016, 2017. The FDA had authorized 3D mammograms back in 2011. Medicare has been covering it almost since the same time with no co-payment. You talk to any oncologist, they will tell you it's more accurate, particularly with dense tissue. And the fact of the matter is you need accuracy to get quick and early detection. When you get early detection, you get early intervention, you reduce pain and suffering for patients, and you save lives. And to me, that really speaks volumes about, your vote is the coin of the realm. That's, as a legislator, tweets are great, speeches are great, going on cable TV, all that stuff. Your vote is an action. That's what you're entrusted with by your constituents. And the fact of the matter is that vote was a bad vote. And frankly, it's not the only one where Mike, again, joined a pretty extreme wing of his caucus, whether it was Jennifer's Law, which strengthened protections for domestic violence, student loan provision to allow employers to write off making payments on behalf of their employees. Again, tiny minority opposing these bills, which were bipartisan in nature and signed into law and are in law in Connecticut today. That's a huge signal for voters in this district because the issue of women's health rights and reproductive rights is going to be front and center in the next Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, 30 seconds.
And thank you for that. And everything that Joe Courtney says about my vote on that bill is incorrect. Because if I was against it, I would not have voted in favor of the funding for that bill. The issue was that there was a municipal mandate. The only funding provided for was the state-sponsored insurance programs. And my towns that I represented would have had an unfunded mandate with a significant cost, a significant increase to their insurance cost that was not funded. I worked to try and remove that mandate, and ultimately when it came to the floor of the House, that mandate was still there, and I voted against it, representing my town.
Thank you, Mr. France. Next question to Ms. Williams for Mr. Courtney first.
Mr. Courtney, Climate change is a concern for many Americans. What measures would you advocate for to reduce our use of fossil fuels and implement more climate-friendly energy sources such as solar and wind?
Sure. So obviously the events in Florida are another reminder where, again, our climate is definitely behaving a lot differently than it has, I think, in history. I mean, the sea temperature, which I think was aggravating the severity of that hurricane, the temperatures that were shattering records every summer, both in the U.S. and across the world. I mean, you know, the environment's sending a message. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which we passed in 2022, was the largest investment in climate change, really, of almost any country in the world. And there's, again, more tax incentives for renewable energy, tax incentives for nuclear, which is also a clean energy that does not emit carbon. And again, that bill is just rolling out now. Homeowners, businesses are taking advantage of it. Farmers are taking advantage of it in terms of installing solar and conservation measures. And again, it's at risk. Project 2025 says they want to just repeal the whole law and go backwards in terms of trying to, again, reduce carbon emissions and get our country aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, 2 minutes.
My background as an electrical engineer, I understand this problem very well. And I'm on all of the above. And the challenge that we face today is that government has decided that wind and solar are essentially the only sources of green energy. And I appreciate the discussion on nuclear because that is the cleanest energy and the most dependable baseload that we have. The challenge with wind and solar is it's not available 100% of the time. And until we resolve that challenge, we need to have things like nuclear and clean natural gas in order to provide baseload and security of energy across our district, across our country. When we look at the problem we have today is the challenge of the decisions related to nuclear power, and we need to make sure that we take care of the waste that comes from that product. There was a decision made by the federal government decades ago to transport that to Nevada. Unfortunately, that has not happened. We need to make sure that we take care of that issue related to nuclear power. But the challenge that we face going forward is how do we maintain a base load while also continuing to explore the opportunities that wind and solar bring to expand the opportunity for green energy and support the cause of removing the carbon emissions that are part of the other sources of energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney.
Yeah, so I've had a front row seat in Washington over the last 2 years with Republican-controlled House, where they have done everything they can to undermine the initiatives of the Inflation Reduction Act. And the fact of the matter is this is very much on the ballot. If we are going to continue the momentum to develop new jobs, green jobs, and they're right in Ellington, Connecticut with Earthlight, who's a solar panel installer that is hiring right now because of the demand for their product that's happening, and that's happening all over the country. We've got to maintain course with the Inflation Reduction Act and not go backwards.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Next question to Mr. Poole for Mr. France.
Mr. France, a majority of Americans are concerned about gun safety. What is your stance on regulation of gun ownership and on outlawing automatic weapons from citizens?
Well, thank you. I think the Second Amendment is sacrosanct, but there are provisions within each state on how they regulate licensing and other factors related to gun ownership. And I believe it belongs with the state. It does not belong with the federal government in that role. The challenge with the provision, you speak about at the end, automatic weapons. Automatic weapons are not allowed to be owned by individuals unless they have a federal firearms license, so that is not even on the table. The issue of the debate that we've had, which is unfortunate, is this term assault weapon, which is a made-up term by the federal government. And we're really talking about semi-automatic weapons, and when you talk about the Founding Fathers and what they envision is what is in common use around the country. And semi-automatic weapons, whether it be in the form of a rifle or a handgun, is the most common access. Right. So regulating at the state level, ensuring access in accordance with the Second Amendment and monitored by the state is the appropriate way to provide gun ownership in a safe manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney, 2 minutes.
Sure. So we're about 6 weeks into the school year here. My office has been getting calls from school districts. We've had about 9 different shooter lockdowns in K through 12 schools around eastern Connecticut. J.D. Vance is out there saying, well, that's just a fact of life that we have to accept. I reject that. I think we can fashion a constitutionally acceptable system of gun violence control, starting with comprehensive background checks, which the Republicans and the NRA has just automatically opposed and rejected and blocked. My opponent, who's been endorsed by the NRA, I think probably would line up in lockstep with that position if he was to go to Washington. We can take other measures like regulating ghost guns, bump stocks. Again, there's just a whole series of measures that fall within the guidelines of Heller versus District of Columbia, which was the constitutional case that Justice Scalia wrote that said that there are exceptions to the Second Amendment that allow background checks and allow that weapons that are way out of the norm in terms of what people need to protect themselves in their home or go hunting can be regulated. And that's really the sweet spot. And I was glad to see my classmate Tim Walz on the debate stage. We came into Congress together as a hunter, is out there advocating that we can find a reasonable pathway forward to stop this epidemic of children being terrified because of the shooter drill reality that unfortunately they're forced to live with.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, 30 seconds.
And while I agree with my opponent on the point that's made related to regulation, it is not for the federal government to regulate. It is for the states to regulate. We are a constitutional republic. We are not a democracy. We are not a dictatorship, and there's no role for the federal government in passing these kinds of laws. The state of Connecticut especially has provided a secure process for licensing, and if the policies that Congressman Courtney wants to see enacted, he should be here in the state legislature recommending that they do that. That is where it's appropriately maintained so that the people have a voice.
Thank you. Next question to Ms. Raff for Mr. Courtney.
I would like to expand on Sophia's question about energy. Connecticut and every other state in this country are looking for clean, sustainable energy. Governor Lamont pushed for a wind power generation plant, which is built right here in New London. It is millions of dollars over budget. There are many delays right now. It's not really clear when it's going to open. What are your concerns about that? And also the fact that Governor Lamont now is a little bit concerned about Connecticut being a customer because the price per kilowatt is very expensive. That may change, but right now it's a little bit of a deterrent.
So I was with him today, actually, at the Connecticut Building Trades, and he was asked this question. And again, his answer was it's a timing issue right now. And there's no question that the effort and investment that's been put in to offshore wind, fueled by the Inflation Reduction Act, investment and production tax credit incentives, is moving forward. There's just no question about it. Rhode Island and Massachusetts did elect to install. And so I think that the momentum is going to continue. And I think that at the end of the day, particularly as we see cheaper solar panels, better technology for battery storage, the costs of renewable energy are going to become by themselves a way that homeowners, businesses, and our state is going to actually save money in the long run.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, you have 2 minutes.
And I agree with the challenge of low energy costs and the cost overruns of the state peer. When I was in the state legislature, I raised this concern when the legislature decided to cap the cost for OSTEG at $75 million, and now we are north of $300 million, all of that on the taxpayers of Connecticut. And the challenge that we face is how do we move forward with that deal? Now, Eversource has backed out of the deal, and how do we proceed forward? What I really kind of interesting is that my opponent talks about wanting to lower energy costs. The number one priority of this Congress was the lower energy costs bill, and he voted against it. To this day, I've not heard any reason for his vote against it other than every Democrat also voted against it. I don't understand that vote either. But when you look at the cost of wind, in fact, they're talking about doing a cost, locking in the cost of wind at 2 to 3 times what the rate is for, we saw a millstone that people are complaining about that now. We need to make sure that we have reliable energy that is affordable for the people of the state of Connecticut. And wind is a challenge with that because it is not. The other challenge we face is there's an environmental concern, both on the front end and the back end, because the windmill blades of the windmills, as well as solar panels for the green energy on solar, are not recyclable and cause environmental hazards in their disposal. And that is something that has never been dealt with in a life cycle cost analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney, 30 seconds.
Yeah, so the bill in question was just a hyper-partisan bill that was crafted with little or no process, and that was basically a giveaway to the oil and gas companies and basically undermining the incentives for renewable energy, which, as I said, is showing impressive signs of growth, and which I think the majority of this country support, particularly, again, as these weather events and what we're seeing out there are happening in greater and greater frequency.
Okay, thank you. Next question to Ms. Williams for Mr. France.
Across the nation, we are witnessing bills that are limiting the rights of LGBTQ+ youth and women. How do you plan to safeguard your congressional district from such bills?
So could you repeat the question?
Across the nation, we are witnessing bills that are limiting the rights of LGBTQ+ youth and women. How do you plan to safeguard your congressional district from such bills?
Thank you for the question. And the important here is the fundamental right of, in our Constitution, we are all created equal, we are all endowed with inalienable rights guaranteed and protected by our Constitution. Equal rights of the individual are sacrosanct, and everybody should have the right to live freely amongst our country. The laws that are being infringing on those rights for the LGBT community or anybody else in society should not be tolerated. We all have the right to live as we choose, and I will stand up for that right at every opportunity. We need to make sure that those freedoms are maintained and that the laws that are there are not infringing on the rights of the individual. That is the importance of our country. It is the freedom that we have instilled in our country and the freedom that we have here in the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, so the way to make sure that those rights are protected is actually to pass the Equality Act, which is a measure, again, I'm a co-sponsor of in Washington, which would basically extend civil rights protection, which has been on the books since the 1960s, to the LGBTQ community. The Supreme Court has already recognized that gender identity is protected constitutionally. They did it for employment, but again, that leaves out a lot of other things like housing and other protections, which again, under the Civil Rights Act, for race and gender are already protected to this day. It's a very simple question in terms of just whether you support equality and civil rights and allow people to have the same rights to succeed in this country as any other citizen.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, you have 30 seconds.
And this is very simple. There's no need for a law. Those rights are already protected. And that is the fundamental thing. We don't need to have another law to protect the rights that already exist for the individual.
Okay, thank you. Next question goes to Mr. Poole, to Mr. Courtney.
What role does Congress have in protecting free speech while preventing misinformation from spreading on social media?
So we are one of the crown jewels of our country is the First Amendment, which really, I think, wisely says that the government does not have the right to control freedom of speech. Again, that is not an unlimited right. We know that. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And again, there are other situations where criminal conduct, like threatening, is not protected constitutionally. So, within those boundaries, the question is, how do we set up a system that, again, passes constitutional muster that also really tries to control the dangers of misinformation, which we're seeing play out in Florida right now with misinformation about what the good people of FEMA are trying to do to save lives and protect property. It's a tricky and difficult issue. I mean, there are some bills that people are promoting, but as I said, you're dealing with the crown jewels, but you're also dealing with a real threat, and it really requires just a lot of hard work to strike that right balance.
Okay, Mr. France, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, and I agree on the sacrosanctity of the First Amendment. It is the crown jewel. It is what is the beauty of our country. But I will tell you, this whole thing about disinformation, well, that is a subjective call. And to say that we're going to hand over control of information to our federal government, the central government, on what we can hear and what we can't hear, I think is a disservice. If there's alternate information, you can share that. And we, the people, are free to read and understand and make our own decisions on what is provided. That's the beauty of the First Amendment. But that's the challenge if you start creating laws infringing on the rights of others. And you have the right to believe what you believe. You have the right to say what you want to say. There are limits to that, but it is not disinformation. It gives too much power to the government to be able to decide what the free people of our country can and cannot say. You run the risk of stifling free speech by turning over the freedom that you all have to a central government to decide what you can and cannot say. It is a very dangerous position to be in, and I would argue that we should not go down that path and allow the free speech of the people to be the banner of what we have as a country and continue to move forward in that manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney?
Yeah, so the thing that Mike doesn't acknowledge is the fact that there are malign forces and actors out there. I mean, there are Russian bots. There are, again, are misinformation campaigns coming out of China and Iran who are aimed directly in terms of trying to undermine our democracy and our Constitution. I think that our government certainly can do a part of the job as far as identifying those malign sources and at least informing people, what the source of these, totally unfounded claims that create fear and also division in our country.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Next question to Ms. Raff for Mr. Courtney.
Congressman Courtney, immigration has certainly been a talker in this election, and it's brought some concerns. Certainly, it's become very political. But one of the things that may not be so political is fentanyl and some of the problems that it has created, because we're all concerned about that. New London has had a huge problem with fentanyl coming into its city, and a vast majority of it comes from across our borders. What can be done to fix that, and would you support the current border reform bill that is now in Congress that was not voted on?
So I would definitely support the bipartisan immigration bill, which sadly President Trump intervened within 48 hours after the agreement was struck and effectively killed the bill. I visited El Paso. It was my third trip to the border back in February, talked to the Customs and Border Patrol agents that are down there. And what they told me is that the bulk of the fentanyl is coming through ports of entry by vehicle, 91% of it, and most of it by American citizens. They need more technology. They need more help to intercept it. That technology exists, and we finally got a budget passed for Homeland Security. It's like a car wash that trucks and cars can go through, and it's much better than X-ray technology, and they are now showing record seizures of fentanyl. By the way, in New London, we had also a huge drop-off of overdoses in 2023 and 2024 because of the hard work of the Ledyard Public Health District. The Norwich Opioid Task Force also made big inroads, and the community has really come together to really turn that picture around in southeastern Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, you have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. And it's correct, there are significant higher stops of fentanyl coming across the border, but it's still coming here, and we still see record deaths among the 18 to 45-year-olds from the deadly disease, the fentanyl deaths from that drug. The challenge with the border, and my opponent brings up the bipartisan bill that he alleges President Trump basically took down, when the reality is it would not have secured the border. And he's talked elsewhere about all the funding for additional border patrol and other things. It's interesting because the number 2 priority of this Congress was H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act. And much of that funding was likely in that bill, but that would have actually secured the border. The bipartisan bill would have still allowed, on average, 5,000 people coming across the border today before the president would take executive action to secure the border at his discretion. These are the things that are not being talked about. That bipartisan bill would have done very little to actually secure the border, where H.R. 2 would have secured the border and restored many of the policies of the previous administration that did have a most secure border we'd had in many, many years. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney, 30 seconds.
So the bipartisan bill was endorsed by the Border Patrol Union, which is a pro-Trump union, and the proponent, the Republican lead negotiator, Jim Langford from Oklahoma, with a very conservative voting record, I mean, he's the one who came out and said, yeah, President Trump killed the bill. I mean, and it happened directly, communication to Mitch McConnell that he didn't want the Congress to pass a bill that would make any progress on this issue. That's putting party before country, totally unacceptable.
Thank you. Next question to Ms. Williams for Mr. France.
Do you acknowledge that President Donald Trump lost the 2020 presidential election? Do you believe that there was widespread fraud, do you believe that widespread fraud changed the outcome of the 2020 presidential election? And lastly, do you recognize January 6th as an insurrection?
Well, first, to the first question, President Biden, the electors were voted on in November. Electors cast their votes in December, and Congress certified that election, and President Biden was sworn in on January 20th. He is the President of the United States. As far as voter fraud, we have no evidence that came through courts that it changed the election. I say there is fraud that happens in every election, but it is generally not determining the outcome of the election. And as far as January 6th being insurrection, if it was, then the people that were arrested on that day would have been charged with insurrection. At best, it was sedition. It was trespassing, and that's essentially what they've been charged with and prosecuted for. That is what happened. It's a travesty that it happened. It interrupted the process of Congress doing its job in order to certify the election. But to call it an insurrection and to have no charges of insurrection ever be filed against anybody who was involved in that is just lying to the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question, because sadly, this issue is still out there with President Trump still campaigning, saying he won the 2020 election, and already, in my opinion, creating doubts about the upcoming election, which is going to happen in 25 days. I was in the Rayburn building, and we were rounded up when the assault on the Capitol began. They wanted to keep a head count of all of us. At 3 o'clock in the morning on January 7th, we again reconvened, went into a chamber with broken glass, and did our constitutional duty to certify the results. In 2016, I did exactly the same thing for Donald Trump. Again, there was a lot of people who didn't like the outcome of that election and were raising questions about it. But in my opinion, that's my constitutional duty, to certify what the Electoral College votes that are reported by each state's governors submits to Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, almost 140 of my colleagues in the House, even after the violence that took place, and surrounded by, damage to really what I think is one of the shrines of democracy, the U.S. Capitol, where Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan. Ronald Reagan gave speeches against Russia. Barack Obama talked about affordable care, and that place was just totally ravaged and vandalized by people who wanted to interfere with a government function. And I think the indictments, you can split hairs about the charges that were brought, but there was no question what was going on there that day. They wanted to shut that place down, and it was totally unacceptable, and we just cannot tolerate that in a democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, 30 seconds.
And I agree. I don't believe that was a proper way to express our objection for those individuals that came into the Capitol. It was trespassing. It did interrupt the due process of Congress in certifying the vote. There is a process within Congress for a representative and a senator to object, and there's a deliberative process that comes from that. That is our Constitution, and that is the process we should uphold. The people should not have been interfering with that, and it is unfortunate that that happened, and the people that did that are being charged and being prosecuted and paying the price for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question to Mr. Poole for Mr. Courtney.
What do you see as the U.S.'s role in achieving peace in Ukraine and in the Mideast?
So I think, when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, who is an ally of our country, that the leadership our country has exerted in terms of bringing together 54 countries in a coalition, NATO leading the charge in terms of making sure that they have the tools to defend their sovereignty and their democracy, which are principles that I think are really basic to the rule of law internationally. And when I talk about Gaza, I'm here with Jerry Fisher tonight, who I see on October 8th, a year ago. He called me early in the morning because his cousin had been kidnapped by Hamas. My office helped him and the family connect with the State Department. And what the U.S. did in November was to negotiate an enforceable ceasefire so that his cousin Liat is now safely at home with her family. That should be number one. Number one, we should be supporting Israel, certainly its sovereignty, but also trying to come up with a diplomatic solution to stop the violence.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, 2 minutes.
The tragedy in all the regional conflicts that we have is it is the policies of the Biden-Harris administration that set the stage for them, supported by Joe Courtney. Why do I say that? Well, the retreat from Afghanistan 3 years ago was an indication to the entire world that we no longer had a significant enough national security interest to maintain a presence in the Middle East. That created a vacuum of leadership, which was filled by China moving into Afghanistan immediately. Putin then invades Ukraine. What people don't know, and most hasn't been talked about in the media, is that back in 1990, when Ukraine became independent, they agreed to give up their nuclear arsenal to Russia in exchange for an agreement by Russia, the UK, and the United States to provide protection for that country. Therefore, we have an obligation to uphold that agreement. That is Ukraine. When you deal with what's happening in Israel, the fact that the Biden-Harris administration took away the restriction on oil sales for Iran and gave them north of $100 billion of money to give to the terrorist organizations of Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. That is what caused this. Otherwise, there would have been no funding for the attack that happened almost a little over a year ago on Israel. And now Israel is defending themselves, rightly so, against a terrorist attack, and it continues to this day from all across that region, caused by the failed policies of the Biden-Harris administration, supported by the silence of my opponent.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney, 30
Yeah,
seconds.
so Mike's candidate for President Trump bragged last year that he's the apple of Vladimir Putin's eye. I mean, can you imagine actually saying that? And he has obviously signaled that he wants to end this war on day one, which for the folks who care about Ukraine, they see as just simply surrender and giving Putin the control of property that he has illegally seized. I'm the only person in this room who is sanctioned by the Russian government. I have a travel ban against me. I wear it with a badge of honor because I will never be the apple in Vladimir Putin's eye.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Next question goes to Ms. Raff, to Mr. France.
I'd like to address the economy. It's something that means a lot to a lot of people, right? And we keep hearing in this election, mainly from Republican candidates, that our economy is bad. But some of the numbers coming out show something different, that our unemployment is pretty low, and there's been significant job growth. But still, people are struggling. People can't afford to buy a home. People can't afford to do many things, groceries. So how do you explain that? And what can be done to make people feel that they can achieve the American dream?
Well, it's a very important question, and it is something that I have heard about as I go around the district. Is one of the top issues I hear about is the economy and to be able for a family to provide for themselves. And it's frankly the policies of this administration, Biden-Harris administration, that supported by my opponent, that has caused this. We saw inflation rise to almost 9%, something we haven't seen in decades. We see interest rates on mortgages at over 7%, something we haven't seen in over 30 years. These are the impacts of failed economic policy, and while the inflation rate is coming down, it is still almost double what it was the last 18 months of the previous administration. That is a policy decision, and the consequences what people are feeling every day. People are having to struggle, whether they pay their electric bill, how they feed their family. Very basic things that we didn't have to deal with 4 years ago when we had an economy that worked for everybody, a border that was secure, and peace around the world. That is what we need to get back to and lead the world in that way.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Courtney, 2 minutes.
Sure. So, I mean, inflation is a global phenomenon. I mean, we can debate that. I mean, the fact of the matter is, though, that prices did go up, and for a lot of people, the reason why they have reported back their unhappiness with the economy is that the prices are still high, even though the rate of growth has actually come down. In my opening remarks, I talked about the fact that, in my opinion, the biggest cost issue for folks is housing. And the way you solve a shortage of housing is build more housing. And in Washington, I have been working with the home builders of Connecticut and advocates for more construction with tax credits for mixed income housing. We've seen some examples of that actually here in southeastern Connecticut that are now opening up, but we need to accelerate that and expand that much greater. The proposal for a tax credit for new starter homes, that's a slice of the home market which doesn't exist anymore. And again, the Connecticut home builders, who are the folks that we're going to rely on to actually take up the task of building more houses, they enthusiastically endorse that proposal. And most of them are Republicans, but they give Harris credit for putting that out there. Affordable child care, again, we need to expand the child block grants that come into the state and also give more tax credits for families and employers in terms of providing more affordable daycare. And lastly, on health insurance, we should extend the prescription drug savings to working age Americans. There's no reason that the 40 to 80% cut in medications that the government just negotiated should be limited to seniors over 65. We should make that available to all Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, 30 seconds.
Thank you, and I will note that nothing that Joe Courtney just said has anything to do with the impact of inflation. He talked a bunch of ideas out there about giving away money in tax credits, giving away money in other things, but nothing to do with the root cause of inflation that the people are feeling and the stories I hear as I go around the district of how do I feed my family or do I pay my electric bill, as an example. Those are things that people of Eastern Connecticut are feeling the pain of, and nothing that my opponent just said has anything to do with that. So he clearly has no plan and just following along with what the party is telling him to do on this particular issue.
Thank you, Mr. France. Next question to Ms. Williams for Mr. Courtney.
Affordable housing is a big issue in this region. What ideas are you proposing to provide affordable housing for all, including young professionals just graduating from college who want to stay in the area?
Yeah, sure. Before I do that, though, just quickly in response to Mike's last comment, the new prescription drug law cut the cost of insulin by 2/3. 11 million seniors across the country now are benefiting from that reduction in cost. The first 10 medications that the government negotiated reduced the price of those drugs by 40 to 80%. That's good for patients. That's good for the Medicare program in terms of strengthening the solvency of that program. And there are going to be succeeding negotiations for more drugs over time, which is going to expand the benefits of that program. We should extend that to all patients. I don't know why that's such a difficult concept to understand when we're talking about cost of living. Healthcare is one of the biggest. I've just listed, again, the various housing programs, which the home builders support, housing advocates support. This is the way you create more supply. If something costs too much because the demand exceeds the supply, you build out more supply. Listen to the home builders. These are not Democrats. These aren't Biden officials. These are the people who want to go out and build.
Thank you. Mr. France, 2 minutes.
Well, I will note once again that the talk about lowering drug costs is not the largest driver of inflation. When you look at the cost of goods, one of the largest drivers of inflation is the cost of diesel. Why? Because in order to get the goods to the Connecticut, over 80% of those goods come via either tractor trailer or train using diesel. Over 90% of the goods that travel internationally come via ship using diesel fuel marine. So when that cost goes up, so does the cost of the transportation of everything we buy. That is what the driver is of the cost, not the cost of prescription drugs. That is not the largest driver, and is not the pain that most families are feeling every day, filling up their gas tanks. Those are the realities of ideas that we need to get back to energy independence so that we are a net exporter and in control of our own destiny when it comes to energy. When you lower the cost of diesel, you lower the cost of every good that you have. When you talk about housing, the market drives that. If you have a demand for housing, people will build, builders will build housing, and the people will then be able to afford to live there. And we're seeing that. I'm seeing it in my own town with a number of housing projects that are coming up because there's a demand signal for people for housing, and therefore there's a free market there to build houses. That is what really drives the economy of house building and home building. That is the way it should be, and it is working in our region because of the demand signal of the increased demand for housing, and the builders are making those houses available and constructing them. As I said, in my own town, I'm seeing several projects that are providing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. France. Mr. Courtney, 30 seconds.
Yeah, so the new insurance rates, health insurance rates, were just released by the state of Connecticut Insurance Department. Again, another big spike this year. If you listen to what the department said, the biggest component of the premium dollar that went up was for prescription drug costs, more than hospitalization, more than physician costs. It's drug costs, which are driving up the premium costs. That's real money out of people's pockets. And what I am suggesting is a way to put that money back into their pockets. You talk about diesel, and I've seen, you've made comments publicly about this, Mike. I checked AAA today. It's $3.55. 2 years ago, it was $5.20, which was way too high. But today, it's back down to a level. Where's the new housing? That, because diesel's down to $3.55.
Thank you,
That's
Mr.
not a
Courtney.
solution.
Sorry, we ran out of time there. We are now down to just a couple more minutes for the next question. So I would ask you for this particular question, just 1 minute each, please, okay? Mr. Poole.
Congress and U.S. citizens are sharply divided on issues. What could you do in Congress to lessen the divide and to encourage respectful dialogue?
So when I was in the General Assembly, I was voted Democrat most admired by Republicans. And when I've been in Congress, I've gotten the highest bipartisan ranking from the Lugar Institute at Georgetown University. That was the institute that Republican Senator Richard Lugar established, trying to promote more bipartisan collaboration. Again, I believe very strongly that in a two-party system, and we've got to actually reach out to people on the other side to get things done. And over this Congress, we avoided default because of a bipartisan coalition. We kept the government open 3 times because of a bipartisan coalition. We passed supplemental assistance for Ukraine, Israel, the Indo-Pacific because of bipartisan cooperation. That's my space in Washington, and what I want to do is continue with that type of leadership, which is what I think the people in this district are desperate for.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. France, 1 minute.
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Sure. Congress and U.S. citizens are sharply divided on issues. What could you do in Congress to lessen the divide and to encourage respectful dialogue?
Thank you. And I will tell you, the lessons that I've learned throughout my time in service starts on the town council. And when I was chair of the Finance Committee, working with Sharon Wadecki, who was my Democrat counterpart, the value that she taught me was the importance of working together, sharing ideas and back and forth. When I got to the legislature, I was the ranking member in the Government Administrations and Elections Committee, working with Dan Fox. I learned from him the value of establishing consensus on what problem we're trying to solve, so that the legislation that we're providing actually solves the problem that's in front of us and not just creates and potentially doesn't create others. And finally, when I was a ranking member in the Appropriations Committee, working with Tony Walker, it was the respect back and forth and the dialogue that happened between us that helped provide a non-contentious debate in there. So it's the valuable lessons that I learned from my counterparts on the Democrat side that I will bring to Congress, working together to work for the people and not have this partisan divide back and forth of not being able to solve the problems the people really elected us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France. So we came to the point of the debate at this point where each candidate has a chance to wrap up their case for why you should vote for them in the 2nd District. Mr. France, you go first.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you to the day. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you to Joe for being here for a good debate. And 43 years ago, I first came to Connecticut to attend sub school. 17 years later, the Navy transferred me back to New England, ultimately retiring in 2005 as stationed at the Supervisor Shipbuilding in Groton, Connecticut, overseeing the delivery of the combat system on Virginia-class submarines. Since I retired, I continue to support the Virginia-class submarine program as a defense contractor and give back to my community, including serving on the council and the state legislature. Now I want to take that experience to Congress and give the residents of Eastern Connecticut the leadership that they deserve. As I walk around the district, I listen to the residents. The 2 issues that I hear most about, we've talked about tonight, are immigration and the economy. People express their concern about the significant increase in violent crime of illegal immigrants in our region. I hear too many stories from family members around the region and their friends who have really paid the price of the deadly fentanyl coming across our wide open southern border. And as we talked about immigration or inflation, it is still at a rate that's almost double what it was the last 18 months, as I said previously. And the real consequence of that is people are having to make very difficult decisions on how to feed their family or pay their electric bill, and young families are struggling to buy a house because the mortgage rates are at the highest they've been in over 30 years. But what is most interesting and most telling about my campaign is the endorsement that I received from the former Democrat Town Committee chair in my own town, who wrote a letter to the editors published in the CT Examiner on September 6th, and read there what her reasoning was. What was most important to tell the difference between Joe Courtney and I was a sentence, and I'll quote, "After many times Joe Courtney's office hung up on me, I really was surprised how quickly Mike France got in front of a solution to all the problems." I think that tells you everything you need to know about the difference between Joe and I.
Thank you, Mr. France. Oh, sorry. Mr. Courtney, 2 minutes.
Sure, thank you. So at the opening, I talked again about the fact that this is a region of Connecticut that's growing. I mean, you can see it with the skyline just across the river. Again, you can see it with new housing construction here in New London. 1,000 new units have actually gone up over the last 2 or 3 years, and there's about 1,000 more in the pipeline. The mayor couldn't be here tonight because he's at a land use committee, again, working again on more projects for more housing in this area. And again, you know, the growth that we're seeing is we need to grab hold of that and to really try to make it sustainable and stronger. And as I said, the biggest needs that are out there is affordable housing, as was brought up here this evening. We haven't had a chance to talk about daycare, but it is crushing working families in terms of having a safe place for their kids to be while they can go to work and support their families. And healthcare costs, again, are still a driving force in terms of employers holding back as far as hiring. We can do better. There's better ways that we can lower costs, and that's why I want to go back to Congress this year. You know, Mike mentioned a case that came through our office. All I will tell you is I am blessed to have the best district director and chief of staff in the congressional delegation with a Yanti grant. Last year, $90 million of constituent savings was generated by our veterans caseworkers, Medicare and Social Security workers, IRS casework that's there. That is, I think, a reputation that resonates all throughout Eastern Connecticut, that we're an office that will help local communities with critical projects, but also individual constituents. And we have the numbers and the data to show that that's the case. Again, I have been blessed to have the honor to represent the people of this state, including Conn College, and it's great to see young people here. I mean, it's your future that's on the line in 25 days, and I believe in that future. I believe in you, and I want to go down there to make sure that we make the right choice and go in the right direction for this great country.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. That concludes the debate. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
All right, you've been watching the 2nd District debate between Democratic Congressman Joe Courtney and Republican Mike France. Be sure to tune in to Eyewitness News at 11 for a wrap-up. Get the latest on WFSB, the app, and you can also read about it in the Day newspaper or theday.com. Thank you for watching, and make sure to vote November 5th. Have a great night.